Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're going to take a little break in our mini-series on presenting the Sicilian in a super fast fashion. So I did the first show of that last week, and I'm going to wait and see what people's comments are before I proceed with the second show. But I thought this week I would do something much more adult, much more grown-up, and take a very long and careful look at just a few positions from one particular game rather than zipping through many positions in a wide range of opening variations. So there's a very interesting story behind this position and this game that we're going to take a look at, or game fragment that we're going to take a look at. So it was played in 1948 between Paul Keres and Keres-Botvinnik. So this was a World Championship match tournament. Every player played 20 games in the event, and this was to determine who would become the champion since Alexander Olyekin had died 2 years before. Now, this was played at the end of the third cycle. There were 5 cycles, 4 games per cycle, and this is between Keres and Botvinnik, as I said. Botvinnik was leading. Keres, I believe, was in second place at the time. I don't remember what Smislav's score was, but I'm pretty sure at this point he was behind Keres. And Reshevsky was a further point behind. So Botvinnik was 8-3, Keres 6.5, 4.5, and Reshevsky was 5.5, 5.5. Well, Keres had white in this game, but as you see, he's down a pawn here, and it's just a matter of whether he draws or not. Now, it has long been bandied about the possibility that Keres threw these games. Now, why would anybody do that? Well, here's the situation, in brief. Keres was from Estonia, and during World War II, prior to World War II, or at least part of World War II, Estonia was in Soviet hands. I believe, though, that during the Second World War, at least, again, part of it, it fell into German hands, or at least matters were sufficiently unclear that Estonians weren't under Soviet control, let's put it that way. And Keres, at that point, played during the Second World War in tournaments that were held, broadly speaking, under the auspices of the Nazi regime. Now, it doesn't mean that he was playing in the Hitler Grand Prix or something like that, but rather he was playing in tournaments that were held under the authority, in the broadest sense, of the German, the German state. So it wasn't that he was necessarily endorsing it any more than he endorsed Stalin and his successors when he was, again, a Soviet citizen, or an American is endorsing Obama now or Bush before by playing in a tournament in the United States. So it's not that there was a political connotation to it from his point of view, but nevertheless, that put him in serious disfavor. And after the Second World War, he was in pretty serious trouble on account of this. And it took some political intervention for Keres to basically be okay from the life and limb standpoint, as well as from the standpoint of his career. So, since at this point in 1948, Botvinnik was to some extent the fair-haired boy in Soviet chess, and Keres was again having to kind of suffer a bit, frankly, because of his performances and his participation during the war. It's thought that also by people who like Keres, another aspect of this is that Keres is an almost universally beloved figure in chess history, while a lot of people really don't like Botvinnik at all. So that, the actual known facts about Keres' political troubles, and the fact that Keres really got beaten pretty badly. He lost the first 4 games to Botvinnik and won the last one when it didn't matter anymore. All of these put together have led to some suspicion about Keres maybe having to throw the games. Now, there's no hard documentary evidence for it, but there is a case to be made for it. So there's certainly good reason to think that there was at least pressure, at least implicitly, on Keres. So you can read a lot more about this. A very good article by Taylor Kingston summarizing the documentary evidence, and that's at chesscafe.com/text/skittles165.pdf. So you can look that up, http://www.chesscafe.com chesscafe.com/text/skittles165.pdf. Or you can go to chesscafe.com, go to the archive section, so scroll down the bottom of the page for that, look for the Skittles room, and then find whatever 165 is. And I think it'll say, I think he has 3 articles in there on Keres-Botvinnik, a couple of them from 1998, and then this one's around 2002, 3, somewhere around there. And if you, again, just do a search for Keres on the page, it'll scroll, you keep going through and you'll find them all. Anyway, that'll give you a very good idea of what the evidence is. You can make up your own minds as to how serious you think it is. I probably am a little more reserved in my conclusion than Kingston. So Kingston thinks that the evidence isn't strong enough for a legally compelling conclusion, but he thinks, practically speaking, it is good enough to say that, yeah, Keres may well have thrown the games. I'm more inclined to say that certainly there was pressure on him. It may have affected him psychologically, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to go all the way and say, yeah, he did. Not only that he did, but even that he probably did throw the games. So I'm hesitant about that. I think maybe had the situation been closer at some key moments, maybe he would have been forced to or would have felt compelled to. But I'm resistant. But nevertheless, it's certainly there's certainly a case to be made, and it's not a crazy view that he did by any means. Okay. Well, in any case, I want to get to this particular position in this game. So as I said, this is from the 3rd cycle, and I was talking with a friend of mine online a few days ago, and he asked me what I thought about this Botvinnik-Keres situation. I said, well, I think that there's some case to be made, but probably Keres didn't throw the games. And he said, well, I thought that too. And then I saw this position, and then he started going on and said, okay, that White can just draw this. It's just trivial. He basically just leaves his rook on the 4th rank from here, and any beginner, any not any beginner, but any competent player would draw this with ease. That no one would play the way Keres did. And so I thought about this for just a few seconds and thought, nah, okay, we're gonna. I have to disprove that it's quite so simple as he thinks. So we played this position, and I took black, he took white. I let him play his easy draw variation, and we'll see, it's not quite so easy. So my friend, who's an expert, by the way, played rook e4, so not a bad player. Played rook to b6. Okay, he just sits on the 4th rank. I check. He goes back. I play rook a3. He keeps sitting. I play g4, rook c4, king h4. And now he realizes that, okay, wait, this isn't so easy. So he was under the impression that this was some kind of Philidor position draw, and now the white rook is going to go flying up to the 8th rank and check, check, check. But in fact, it doesn't work. Black will just take the pawn on a4 and move the king away towards the queen side and win very simply. So if there were no a pawns, yeah, this would be a very easy draw. Many different ways. You don't even need Philidor when it's a g pawn. So if there's just a g pawn, you can even leave the rook on the 1st rank, put the king on g1, and just sit there forever. And the only thing you have to make sure that you don't allow is something like king on g3, pawn on g2, rook to h1 mate. That's the only way you can lose that, short of dropping your rook. But with the a pawns on the board, it's not easy at all. So he realizes, okay, I can't bring my rook up, so I'll play this. Okay, check, here, here. And my friend, in effect, resigned in this position. Because I'm going to play g3. He's going to have to bring his rook back to d1. So g3, rook to d1. And then I take this 2nd pawn and win very easily many different ways. One way would be to just play rook to b2, bring the pawn to a2, and play rook to b1. And he basically can't do anything about that plan because if his rook ever leaves the 1st rank, he gets mated. So, very simple. Now, it turns out that he had gotten this from reading a reasonably well-known figure in American chess, not a particularly strong player. He's about an A player. He's been an expert. But so a person who had a relatively high degree of prominence over the past decade or so. Won't mention who it is, but I'll quote from his commentary about this match and this particular position specifically. So he says this. There were a lot of bad moves in this game. Botvinnik missed an outright win much earlier for whatever reason. Okay, and he says, after that, the game boiled down to a clear draw, but Keres generously gave away a pawn for no particular reason. After move 52, the following position was reached, and it's the position you see before you. And he says this, although white is a pawn down, this is a standard textbook drawn position. This position has occurred in minor variations tens of thousands of times. Every tournament chess player, while working his way up, finds it necessary to learn certain basic positions. This is one of those positions. Every player, by the time he has reached about 1600 in chess strength, should be expected to know this position cold. The drawing technique is simple. White leaves his rook on the fourth rank. Eventually, to make progress, black must advance his pawn to g4. White then must immediately move his rook to the eighth rank and start checking from behind. The black king cannot escape the checks, and the game is a draw. What did Keres do? He made a move that even a 1600 player would be embarrassed to make. He retreated his rook to d3, allowing Botvinnik to seize the fourth rank with 53 rook f4. The game was still probably not completely lost, but a few more bad moves by Keres caused the game to be lost. Anyone can make a blunder. However, when a player blunders, almost always there is a reason. What possible reason could Keres have had for making a move like 53 rook to d3? The answer is obvious. He must have dumped. The theory that the games were fixed is not new. Ever since the days these games were played, observers have remarked that these games were obviously fixed. Close quote. Okay. Well, as we've just seen, that easy 1600 defensive idea is just a complete failure. It loses very easily. So there are quite a few lessons we can take from this, and we're going to discuss the actual game in much more depth. But we can already take stock of a few, I think, really valuable lessons. So the first one is a purely chess lesson, and it's that you have to be aware of seemingly minor differences. The fact that the A-pawns are on the board makes a huge difference. As we just saw, white can't just play as if this is the regular old Philidor position, because he'll lose the A-pawn, and with it lose the game. So there's that to be realized. Secondly, I think it's appropriate to have a kind of a principle of charity, especially when you're looking at the games of a player 600-700 points stronger than you are. All right. Now, it does happen that even the best players in the world blunder. Kasparov has blundered, Karpov, Fischer, everybody blunders. All right. And I mean outright blunders. Okay, so it does happen. But you should at least have a very strong burden of proof or a very strong presumption in that player's favor. All right. So, yeah, Keres is fallible. Botvinnik's fallible. We all are. But you got to give him the benefit of the doubt. If you're in 1800, 1900, even 2000 or 2100, which I think he was very briefly, you've got to have some humility. You have to think, okay, this guy's a great player. So rather than assuming the fix is in, it's at least worth considering that there might be something either wrong with my really obvious idea, or there may be something that motivates even an ugly-looking move like rook to d3. Okay, so that's the second point. On the other hand, of course, you should be aware of authority, and my friend, who's also an expert, who's as strong as this player, in fact, I would say stronger, kind of bought it hook, line, and sinker as well, and was kind of cowed by what he read. Well, in fact, look for yourself. So, respect authority, don't worship it. But the point is, that doesn't contradict what I was saying before. It isn't that you should worship Keres, you shouldn't worship any of these players, any people, but you should have respect for them. So you should at least think, okay, even if they went wrong, there's some intelligent reasoning behind what they did. Try to figure that out. Now, it doesn't mean you accept what they did uncritically, but you think about it, you take it seriously. Okay, what other lessons are there? I would say that there's also the lesson that you really have to be careful not to be in the grips of a theory. Okay, famous example in history, one that's brought up no end, and I think misleadingly, is the example of Galileo and the church. Okay, so you had some people who were not even willing to look through the telescope because they knew, quote unquote, that Jupiter couldn't have satellites, couldn't have any moons. All right. Now, in fact, the whole story I think is more complicated and very interesting. But of course, there's no question that many people at the time, and this happens throughout all of history and with all ideologies, there are people who come to believe a certain theory, and they get to the point where the facts become practically irrelevant. And that, I think, is perhaps the case here, that the person in question is so sure that the fix was in that even that a sympathetic examination of the game becomes impossible. So, okay, there's a little bit of epistemology for you, and hopefully it'll benefit you in some way. But of course, you'll have to decide for yourself about that. But that's at least my thinking about this, about how a pretty good player can go so very badly wrong in his at least his claim about the draw. Now, let's actually think about this position some and try to figure out how white can actually draw this. Now, there are a number of approaches that can be used in these kinds of endings. Now, one thing you could do already from here, right, you don't have to wait for the pawn to go to g4. If checking from behind is such a great plan, why don't we do it right away? So let's consider rook to d8 now, and we'll start checking. Because this is essentially what our commenter here was saying white should do after g4. Well, we can do it here because the black king can't hide in front of the pawn on g4 himself. So let's see if this works. Well, rook to f4, and we see the a pawn is leaving. So we might as well get some checks in, see if it gets us anywhere. Okay, so much for the checks. Play rook h5. Black defends the g pawn. We're out of checks. We lose the second pawn. Easy win. So rook to d8 and this whole Philidor idea simply doesn't apply in the position. Okay, what else is there? Well, we can try a5. And this is actually pretty interesting. I think that this may be a draw. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think there are at least interesting drawing possibilities. Now, this is actually quite similar to what Keres chose, but white gets a little bit more space on this occasion. Okay, well, let's try rook f5 to tie the white rook down, rook a4. And now think of a couple of different plans for black. So one is to try to play as I did against my friend, with rook to b5. So we're going to get the rook over to the side, give check, and try to bring the king down as far as we can. So rook a3, see, this is a problem. I don't get that check in anymore. So let's say g4. Okay, he's in Zugzwang. He's got to give ground with either the king or the rook. So rook a2, rook b3, king g2, king h4. Now we'll try to just wait. King h2, rook b5, king g2. And here we see the big problem. Black can't get in g3 because white has rook to a4 check. That's what makes the big difference. So in the position where white's rook is on a3, as in the game, or with my friend's attempt to keep the rook on the fourth rank, I was able to get g3, king h3 and win. Here, it's not going to happen. So rook h1, king h2, rook b3, king g2, rook d3, king h2, and white just sits, waits, and draws. Okay, so another try. I think I tried something like this, rook f2, and just running around here, but again, it's the same thing. The rook goes to a2, when the king goes to h4, and then king h2, g2. And I don't see how black makes further progress. So it looks like a5 may be a draw. Okay, the best approach, though, which I was able to figure out pretty quickly, is rook to d5. And the point is, okay, let's say rook to b6, rook to a5. And this draws pretty cleanly. Now, it's really funny that it draws because the rook on a5 looks kind of goofy there. I mean, it's completely immobilized, vertically speaking, and doesn't seem to do very much horizontally either. But the whole point is that it ties black's rook down to the a6 pawn. And without that pawn, white can draw. So, for instance, rook to b3, king g2, and now black has to try something active. So here's one possible continuation. So king g4 takes, check, king g1. I think this even draws. King f1 is a safer draw, but it seems to me that this will work too. So king g3, rook f6, rook to b1. Actually, this is fine. Because, okay, if rook to a2 here, remember what I said before? No, not king f1, rook f1. Rook f1 draws. White can just defend passively here, and it's impossible for black to win. So rook to b1 check, rook f1, takes. This is the only winning try for black here, but white's in time. Black queen's first, white queen second, but there's nothing to be done. So this is a draw. Okay, well now we've discussed this position a bit, but I have to say something further about our position, which is that this isn't in fact the actual position from the game. There was a mistake in the chess-based database, so it goes back to the position a few moves ago. So in this position here, which occurred after white's 47th move, so those of you who were looked this up in your chess-based database, they've got it wrong, unfortunately. So there it continues, rook takes d7, rook takes d7 check, rook f7, rook d4, rook f6, a4, king g6, h4, king h5, takes. Okay, and this is what we got. This is the position that the writer that I mentioned before gives as well, but it's mistaken. So the actual move order is not with rook takes d7, but rook takes d2. So rook takes d2, rook c7, rook d4, rook c6, a4, king g6, h4, king h5, hg. So very similar, but black's rook is on c6 now instead of on f6, which actually favors him. So this helps black out quite a bit. Now, before we analyze this, though, I want to look at another very important position a few moves before. So I wanted to get the game score correct for you guys. After that, everything is exactly the same. So, in fact, so rook d3 happened, rook c4, rook a3, a5 here, rook to b4. Okay, so at this position, at this point, the game score the rest of the way in chess-base is correct. So once you get to move 55, when you're fixing it, those of you who have Mega or some other chess-base database, once you get here, the rest you can trust, but you have to fix it to this point. Okay, but I want to go back and discuss this ending. Okay, so rook takes d2, rook d2, rook c7. All right, now from here, white plays a very good move. He plays rook to d4. Now you might think to play h4, trying to swap off a pair of pawns here, but this is bad. The reason why it's bad is because of rook c3 check, king g4, and now not rook takes a3. That would be an easy draw. So rook a3, hg, king g5 is really an easy draw. When you have just an extra rook pawn, I mean, unless things are really favorable for you, that's going to be a draw, and so it is here. But the problem is not rook a3, but rook c4 check, and then taking on h4, and this does win. White doesn't get enough counterplay with king f5 to hold. Okay, so Keres played a very nice move here. He played rook to d4. So this way, he is threatening to play h4. And now, for example, if rook to c3 check, king g4, rook a3, here, rook to d7 check holds. So if king to g8, rook to d6, if black's king comes up, white just checks again. And on rook to a4 check, king f5. It's a very good move. Okay, so the point is, again, king g7, rook d7 check, no progress for black. And if rook h4, then king f6 is really good, because rook takes h3, and white gives perpetual. So rook d8, d7, d8, d7, forever and ever. So you notice that white's plan of going active here is really very powerful. It's the way to go. And that's very often the case in rook endings, that activity is more valuable than material, up to a point. I mean, if you're down the rook, then it doesn't count. If you're down a million pawns, it probably doesn't count either. But very often, it's worth sacrificing a pawn, and even sometimes two, for activity. And so it is here. So Keres' move here, rook to d4, was really very nice. Okay, one other variation, sorry. So rook a3, rook d7. All right, we just looked at king to g8. Okay, if king f8, then rook h7, rook a4, king g3, rook h4. So here, black's king is a little bit more active, white's king is less active, and he still managed to protect the h-pawn. The problem is that white does this little tick-tock pendulum maneuver here, rook to a7. Black has nothing better than rook to a4, because this 2-on-1 ending on the king side is a very easy draw. Very easy draw. So, the more when all the pawns are on one side, a one pawn advantage is usually not enough. But the more pawns there are, the bigger the problem is. So 3 versus 2 is generally a fairly easy draw. 2-on-1, pretty easy draw. 1-0, very easy draw. 4 versus 3, okay, there it's getting kind of iffy. I mean, even Kasparov managed to lose a very good rook and 3 versus rook and 4 position. Okay, but here the 2-on-1 is just nothing. And so anyway, rook a4, rook h7. If black gives up the h-pawn, that's going to be a draw as well. Okay, so after rook to d4, Botvinnik played rook to c6. Okay, and now here we have another important position. Here Keres played a4, which was criticized by almost everybody who I've seen comment on the game. So Golombek, who's an old British international master, criticized it. Hans Kmock, who's an American international master, criticized it. Keres doesn't give any punctuation to it, but he suggests that there was another move that was much better. And I believe Liebenfish and Smyslov, in their book on rook endings, also give this a question mark, if I'm remembering right. Okay, so instead of a4, what should white do? Well, there are in fact a couple of moves that are okay. One is definitely the best move, I think. The second move is also okay, but perhaps not as clear. So let me suggest that you guys stop the recording here and try to figure out what white's move ought to do. Okay, well, as I said, there are two moves. The clearest draw, and I think praised by everyone, is rook to a4. And this is like rook to a5 that we saw in our almost correct position. So white is just going to tie the black rook down to the a-pawn, and is also going to play for a4 fairly quickly as well, liquidating one pawn over there. So, for instance, if king to g6, this is a variation Keres gives, rook a5, rook c3 check. You'd like to go to g4, but h5 is mate, so we go backward. But black hasn't achieved anything, so rook c6, king g3, draw. Okay, a better try for black is king to f6, but white is okay here too. A couple of good moves. So h4 is okay. Immediately going for the swap here. And now, all right, g takes h4, king e6 is probably the most dangerous attempt for black. White will probably play rook to a5 or king h5, but at least here there's some challenge. Actually, no, I'm sorry, not king h5. In this position, what white ought to do is shadow black's king. So rook a5 is okay, but then as the black king heads over to the queen side, white's king should follow suit. And depending on where the king goes, white will bring the rook to h5, and again continue to follow black's king over to the queen side. So notice that black can't win the a-pawn without giving up the h-pawn in return in such a variation. And by doing so, with white's king sufficiently close, it'll be an easy draw. Okay, so another try after h4 is just to play king g6, but then it's quite easy for white. Just swap king g4, and black is going nowhere. White here will just leave the rook on the fourth rank and draw. Okay. Also, instead of h4, white could play rook to a5, cutting the king off as much as possible. After king e6, playing h4. And now, okay, if rook c3 check, just king to g2. And again, black doesn't have time to take because white will take that one, and then take that one, and take that one, and draw easily. So takes, king d7. Again, the king's going to come scurrying over, king g3. And if rook f6, a4, king c7, rook h5 with an easy draw. So again, black can't make progress without moving his rook away, but moving the rook away allows white's king to come over to the queen side. So this will be a draw. An easy draw even. Okay, so that was rook to a4. h4 has also been suggested, but the analysis of this move has been inaccurate historically. So both Keres and Liebenfish and Smyslov analyze this, but they overlook that there's a mistake in what they give. So rook c3 check, king g4, g takes h4, and now both analysts, or well, three analysts, both, let's say, analysis pairs, both volumes, give king takes h4. Okay, after rook takes a3, Keres correctly, or stops here and correctly evaluates the position as winning for black. But Levenfish and Smyslov go on and claim that this is a draw based on their earlier discussion of the Vancouver position. Now, you may remember we discussed the Vancouver position in an earlier lecture, so I'd suggest looking that up if you're not sure what that is and how it works. But basically, the idea is this. Okay, so rook to d6, and I think, yeah, they stop at this point and just say, okay, compare this to diagram 130 on page 82, and it's a draw. But in fact, it's not a draw here. So the idea behind the Vancouver position is this. The king blockades, well, okay, there's the Vancouver position with just one pawn, and there's, let's say, a two-pawn Vancouver position. But the basic idea is this. When there are two pawns, the king is going to blockade the pawn on the one side, and the rook is going to take aim, or keep in its sights, the other pawn. So as this pawn moves up, the rook is going to keep it tagged over here. And because it's an A pawn, so it only works if it's a rook pawn. If it's another pawn, black's king can come over and then hide over here where there's nothing. Okay, so because there's no over there when it's an A pawn, white's rook will end up on the F file at some point and be able to give checks on squares like this. So black's king can't hide. When the king runs away, white just keeps the rook attacking the pawn. The problem is here, however, that because of white's king's bad position, this Vancouver defensive idea doesn't work. So for instance, a5, rook to d5, a4, say rook to d4, and now watch, rook a1, king h3, so we've got to come back down the board. Now, if it was white's move, king g2, and then this position is a draw. However, a3, well, we got to play rook to d3 if we're going to Vancouverize the position. But now, look, a2, and you can't keep doing it because rook h1 check wins. So, okay, white can do things that put up more resistance than this, but in every variation, black is winning. And that's the problem. White doesn't have time for this Vancouver setup, and other attempts are just are going to be inadequate. So, for instance, going back here to the start of it, okay, so this is where Levenfish and Smyslov said it's a draw. a5, okay, and now instead of rook to d5, let's suppose white plays rook a6. This looks pretty sensible. We keep the king cut off, we put the rook on a good square, but as you'll see, it still doesn't do the job. So rook a1, a4, now you put the pawn on a3. So you don't go further, then it would be a dead draw. So if the pawn's on a2, white just leaves his king on h2, and the rook on the a file, and it's a dead draw. But with the pawn on a3, it creates this cubby hole for the black king on a2. So watch. King g2, h5. Note that if white tries to run over with his king, king e2, now a2 does win because the king is in no man's land. He's too late to go back to f2 because rook h1, threatening the queen, and if rook takes a2, then rook h2 and rook takes a2. So king g2, he's got to hide over here. h5, king h2, king f7. Now the king is going to come up, or he's going to come over first, then it's going to come up, hide in the little box, and then he undoes, he kind of climbs out here like this. And it'll come down to a race, and as we'll see, white's king is just too far away. So rook a4, and okay, here too black has to be very accurate. So for instance, if he played king to f6 here, this would be a blunder. White plays rook f4, and then rook f3, and he achieves the Vancouver position. So black plays king g6. Very slick move here. So rook a5, h4, and this takes away g3. That's the point of this move. Okay, so rook a4, rook a2, king h3, king f5, king takes, king e5, king comes back. But it's just a little too far away, and he never has the chance. See, because the rook doesn't have room to give its check and come down, he's never going to be able to set up Vancouver. So king f2, king c5, king f3, So you're trying to stay as close as possible. So that way if A2, you can run back to G2, but if you have the chance and the need to run your king to the queen side, you're at least one file closer over. But as we'll see, it's still too late. King B5, rook A8, king C4, check, check, king A2. Okay, so now that A2 is impossible, the king comes running over, but it's one file too far away. Rook B1, king to B2. Okay, so let's say king to D3. King to D2 loses also because he escapes like this and wins. All right, so king to D3 prevents him from boxing out that way, but now he sneaks out along the first rank. Okay, so we still have a little trick, threatening mate on G1, but now rook to B3, king C4, and then rook C3. Actually, it's not the only way to win, but it works. So this is the best move here. Now, if he takes black queens and then is going to win the rook with some fancy stepping, and next move queen to C4 check, or queen to C4 check next move, and then queen takes G8 the move after that. Okay, so back here, if he tries king to D4, now rook A3, rook G1, and now the king has room to escape out this side. Now, that was a really complicated variation. I certainly don't expect you to completely understand all of that. I am quite skeptical that I would produce all of that in a tournament game. In fact, I would say very, very likely that I would not. But the thing is, the basic concepts I understand. So black is trying to prevent white from setting up a Vancouver position, so that part's key. The ideas for white, the defensive ideas for white are pretty clear too. And it just works out that white can't quite hold the game, that's all. So it's, these rook endings are quite complicated. And, what you essentially want to do is you want to have as many ideas in your toolkit as possible, so you at least know where you have to look. You may not be able to find all of the neat little finesses. I mean, that takes a lot of time, a lot of development of skill, a lot of study. But to know the basic ideas and to get some feel for how to use them, that's much more accessible. So, won't guarantee 100% perfect play, but if you at least know what the relevant ideas are, it greatly increases your chances of finding the best moves in an actual tournament game. Okay, so this just goes to say that Keres had it right about king takes h4, rook a3. Levenfish and Smyslov, great players. Smyslov is a former world champion. They even managed to get this wrong, which just shows, again, how complicated chess can be. Now, instead, though, a move that neither player looked, neither set of analysts found, was instead of king takes h4, white can throw in rook to d7 check first. And this actually draws the game. So if the king comes up, then rook d6 and rook takes a6 is an immediate draw. And if king f8, now king takes h4, rook a3, king h5 is indeed a pretty easy draw. Certainly it is a draw. So let's take a look here. We'll try to follow it up and see if why this is different. So king e8, rook over, king d8 takes, king c8, king g5, king b8, rook e7. Let's say rook c3, king f4, a5, rook e4, king b7. Now again, it looks as if white's king is too far away and black's king is going to come up and help the pawn move and so on. But it turns out that white is actually all right here. So rook a4 is a good move, king b6, king e4, king b5. And now it's not necessary here, but it's, again, a nice finesse, king d4. So we'll get our king one square closer in before we retreat the rook. Okay, rook a1, a4, king d3. And so you notice here the king is on the d file. And basically the rule of thumb is that if the white king can get to the d file, it's a draw. Okay, so when the king was cut off on the e file and out of their position, black was able to just win. Here, he's not even in as good a shape, but he can't win. So king b4, check. Here, king d2, king a2, rook b4. And here, it's a draw. So by the time, well, the problem for black is that he doesn't have time to maneuver his rook to b1 before white's king plays king c2. See, that's the whole problem. He's got to be able to get the rook to the b file and then get his king out of the box. Here he can get his the rook to b1, but only by allowing white's king to the c file when the king can no longer get out of the box. So this is a drawn position. All right. So all this goes to say, or goes to show, that after rook c6, h4 is a draw as long as white plays the accurate rook to d7 check, and rook to a4, which is a very good idea we're going to see again later on, we already saw before, is a draw, and fairly straightforwardly. Okay, but Keres' move, a4, while certainly not best, isn't losing either. Okay, Botvinnik played king g6, h4 happened. See if I need to discuss rook to d5. So rook to d5 is also a draw instead of h4. But this is basically going to be like what we could see a couple of moves later. So let's look at h4 first. So h4, king h5, takes. And now we have the critical position that we mentioned before. The difference here being that black's rook is on c6 rather than on f6. But that doesn't really change anything fundamentally. The plan of passive defense with the rook staying on the fourth rank, the so-called 1600 player draw, just fails dismally for the same reason. Black plays rook c3 check, rook a3, g4, king h4, rook a2, and g3, king h3, and so on, eventually forcing white to give up the a-pawn if he wants to avoid getting checkmated, after which it's a simple win for black. So that loses. Rook to d8 is again hopeless. Same reason. Rook c3, and then rook c4. What else? Okay, here a5 is completely hopeless as well because of rook c3 check, and then rook a3. Okay, here white has to play rook to d5, but then king h4, and again this is going to be just like what I had with my friend. So what else is there? Well, in fact, there's one way to draw, and one way to draw only. Keres chose rook to d3, and this actually makes a lot of sense. So I mean, it looks kind of silly. Rook c4, rook a3. Ha, isn't Keres stupid, or isn't he throwing the game? Well, no. I mean, this makes sense because we saw in an earlier position with the pawn on a4 and the rook on a4 and white's king on g4 that was a perfectly adequate defensive maneuver. So the rook on a4 protects the pawn, and it also protects the rook from side checks, which drive it back. So it's not at all obvious why this should be a losing move for white at all, why this plan is bad. Okay, well, we'll see what in fact happened in the game and why this doesn't work out, but while the rook is a little bit silly on a3, it's performing two very useful functions, and it's not immediately evident why this is so bad. Okay, furthermore, in Keres' defense, okay, this is move 53 here. Now, in the good old days, the time controls went like this. So for all international events, it was 40. You had 40 moves to make in 2.5 hours. After that, or after 5 hours of play, so obviously no sooner than move 41, but it could be some moves later depending on how fast the players were going. But after 5 hours of play, the game would be adjourned. In other words, they would stop the game. The player whose move it was would write down the move, slip it in an envelope that he would give to the tournament director or the arbiter, and then they would stop playing for however long a period, sometimes a couple of hours, sometimes some number of days. Often it would be the next morning, and then they would open the envelope at the resumption and resume the game from there. And of course, they would have analyzed in the meantime as much as possible. The player who seals has the advantage of knowing what he did. On the other hand, it's possible he sealed a bad move, so there can be a disadvantage to it as well. Anyway, they would play for another couple of hours, and maybe it was 2.5 hours. I don't remember if it was 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something along those lines, and then resume again or adjourn again. Now, the secondary time control was 16 moves in 1 hour. So move 56 would be the control for the second time limit. And so here we are, this is move 53 here. And there were a number of surprises along the way over that time period. So it's not necessarily the case that this would have been a position Keres would have analyzed in advance, and it's possible that he was in time pressure at this point as well. So given a choice, okay, you can see that passive defense loses. I'm sure he saw that pretty quickly. So I'm sure he saw pretty quickly that rook to d8 loses. He might have spent some time thinking about a5. And so here you've basically got a choice between rook d3, a3, which is very natural. You stop the check. You don't let black drive your king further back. And what in fact turns out to be the only drawing mechanism. So I think with all of this put together, Keres' error is quite comprehensible from the standpoint of a player who's actually trying to win the game and doesn't require any theories about taking a dive. Now, let's see what he should have done. What he should have played, which we mentioned in the context of the slightly wrong chess-base position, is rook to d5, with the idea of playing rook to a5. Now, again, this is a little bit scary because, and this position, this, by the way, is a better position for black than what we had there. So there, it wasn't too difficult to draw. Here, it's harder to draw because black's rook is already on c6. See, there it was on f6, and he had to waste a tempo bringing it to the side so he can give check. Here he gives the check right away. So rook to c3 check. Okay, and now a couple of variations. So Golombek, whose variation I think is flawed, gives the following line. So he thinks that white's already losing here, and he puts all the blame on a4 a few moves ago. So he says king f2, king h4, and he continues rook a5, rook c6, rook d5, rook f6 check, king g2, king g4, rook a5, king f4, rook c5, rook e6, and he stops here and says black is winning. Well, it turns out that there are at least two mistakes in his variation. One is that there's a clear draw earlier, we'll come back to it, but also that this is still a draw by Vancouver of all things. So let's have a look. So king f2, we prevent rook to e2 check, rook e5, rook c6, a5, now rook f6 check, king e4, rook b6, rook c5. So black is going to bring his forces over to the queen side. See, he's got an ideal position here with this rook. It's covering the a pawn, it's covering the g pawn, so his pawns are immune, and he's going to try to wiggle his king over and somehow win the a4 pawn. Let's see. King g3, king d3. Let's even help him along. Rook d6 check, king c3, rook b6, rook c4. So there it goes. The a pawn is falling. But watch. Rook b5, rook a4, rook g5, rook a1, and here white has two drawing moves. And see if you can figure out what they are, and see if you can figure out what the basic theme is. Well, once again, it's our good old friend Vancouver. Yes, sirree. So you can either play king to h2, which I think is probably the most elegant move. It's probably what I would choose. So that way you have access immediately to rook for the rook to g3 and g2. Or you can play rook to f5, which has the same function. So let's see how this... Well, actually, yeah, I stopped the line here, but basically we just keep the pawn in our sights. So the king is going to come back to the second rank at some important moment. But basically we just give our checks. And so as the king approaches the rook, we give checks. Also, you know, whenever the king is defending the a pawn, we check it away. That's the fundamental thing. And other than that, when the king is not protecting the a pawn, we keep the rook attacking it from a square on the f file. And you just do that, and the position's a draw, because it keeps black's rook stuck on the a file, and he has nowhere to run to. So this is a very simple draw here. All right, going back. Okay, so rook c3, again, Golombek is king f2, king h4. I would just point out another draw is rook to d6. Just attack the pawn, and we're going to win the pawn. And the point is that in this position, black is not winning. So a5. Now, if white doesn't have the a pawn, it is winning, but we'll see what white can do. Believe it or not, white's king is going to help the a pawn, and he's going to draw that way. So rook to c1 check, king e2, king g2, rook g6, g3, a6, rook a1. And now black is going to play things like king h2, g2, king g1, and then force the white's king away someplace and try to promote. But white's king is now close enough. So king d3, king f2, king c4, g2, king b5, and it's a draw. White's just going to give up his rook for the pawn, and White's own pawn is so far advanced that he'll draw without any problem. Okay, so that's rook d5, rook c3, king f2. Now let's look at king to g2, which is given by Kmach, Liebenfish, and Smyslov, and Keres alike. So king h4, rook d6, a5, rook d5. This is useful for black to throw in. So you might wonder, well, why is black making this kind of spite pawn move? I mean, he's going to lose the pawn anyway. Who cares where you lose it? Well, the thing is, White wants to have rook to h6 check in response to g4 to drive black's king back a little bit. So the point of a5 is that after rook to d5, that option's not going to be open to him anymore. White's rook is going to be on an inferior square relative to black's king. Okay, but all the same, if g4, rook a5, rook c2, here White has to be very careful. Just plays king f1, not g1, but f1, and then on king g3, rook a8. And this is going to be similar to the line that I gave in response to Golombek's variation. Okay, another try. Rook c2 check here. Again, White has to be careful. Go to f1. So that way, after king to g3, there's no mate threat. So once again, g4, rook a5, king g3, rook a8. And now let's continue this variation a bit. Rook c1, king e2, king h2, a5, g3, check, a6. And now another drawing idea for White, rook h6. And you just sit here, and again, black is not going to be able to win this. So his king goes over, just check him back, and he's stuck. So this is another way for White to draw. So the point is that this funny idea of rook to d5 followed by rook to a5 does seem to draw. All right, so White grabs the pawn, and whoops. Yeah, sorry. Okay, actually, in some lines he doesn't bother. He doesn't play rook to a5, but plays rook d6, keeping the rook active. But eventually he ends up winning the a-pawn and all these variations, and has just enough defensive resources to hold the game. Okay, well, let's look at rook to d3 now. We'll move on with the game and try to figure out, well, what's so bad about this? So rook c4, rook a3, what's the big deal? Well, okay, black plays a5, and now White sits. King h3, rook b4, king g3, rook f4. So here they made the time control, and they needed to make a few more moves to get to the adjournment. And this is also good technique by Botvinnik. So you don't want to mess anything up. So when you're in a position where you're better, and you're better permanently, there's nothing that White can do concretely to force a draw, it's a very good idea to just waste time until you accrue some kind of temporal benefit. So in their case, they had an adjournment, which was magnificent for Botvinnik. But for us, we should have that attitude about a time control. So if you're in time trouble and you're better, and you're better in a position where if you just sit there, nothing will go wrong, then you should sit there until you make the time control. So you wait until you got the extra time. Don't do anything committal. Wait until you've got another hour to play with, and then you work everything out. So that's what Botvinnik does. So he just makes some meaningless moves here, and then here the game was adjourned, and he was able to work things out. So the plan ultimately is, once again, for black to bring his king over to the queen side and win in that way. And it turns out that White's rook is, the passive state of White's rook is detrimental with respect to this plan. He's not going to have a chance to set up Vankura in this instance. So king g3, rook d4, rook a1, king d5. Okay, yeah, actually, sorry, here the game was adjourned. Not on move 61, but here on move 63. Okay, so Keres plays rook to b1 with the idea of playing rook to b5 check. And if rook to a4, okay, here's a little quiz for you. Can White set up the Vankura draw here? And if so, how? So once again, good place to stop the recording. See if you can figure it out. Okay, well the answer is yes. Rook to b5 check, king c4, rook takes g5, rook a1, king h2. And is just in time. And again, we've got the perfect setup. The rook is taking aim at the a5 pawn. It has it in its sights. And black's king is not yet protecting the pawn. So if the black king were on b4, and it was black to move, it would be too late, because then he can move his rook off of the a file, and that's basically what he needs. He needs something to be able to block these side checks. If he can do that, it's a draw. Or if black can block the side checks, he wins. If he can't, it's a draw. Okay, but this was too simple a trap after an adjournment for Botvinnik to fall for. He plays rook to b4. Okay, Keres plays rook to f1. Again, hoping to play rook to f5, but Botvinnik plays king to e4, stopping rook to f5 altogether. Now, if king to g4, again trying to get rook f5 in, and also just take the pawn, is too late. So rook takes a4, and okay, after king takes g5, rook c4, the rook is off the a file, and the king position is so good for black that he will win. Okay, so Keres tried rook to e1 check, king to d4. If you consult with your table bases, it'll tell you that black is giving checkmate in no more than 41 moves with best play for both sides. Okay, it's probably outside of our capacity to play all those moves perfectly, but the ideas are all simple at this point. So if, well, okay, let's look at how the game concluded. So king h2, trying to set up Vancouver, but too late. Rook a4, rook g1, rook c4. So he's off of the a file. So if he had played something like king to c3, that would have been a blunder. King c3, rook takes g5. I'm pretty sure that's a, oh, yeah, positive, pretty close to positive that's a Vancouver draw. But rook to c4 prevents that. So rook takes g5, a4, king g2, king c3. Here comes the king. King f3, a3, rook a5, king b3, and here Keres resigned. So he's just going to play a2, rook a4, and queen, and that's it. So, a very instructive ending, certainly. We see how razor thin this edge can be between a draw and a loss, and again how precise the Vancouver setup has to be. So a couple of times he was within a tempo of getting it, couldn't get it. We saw that Levenfish and Smyslov mistakenly thought on one occasion that there was a Vancouver draw where there wasn't one, and it's kind of ironic that a lot of commentators who criticized Keres for this or that often made mistakes of their own in the analysis. And it's possible that I made some too, but I'd like to think that I didn't. But there are a couple of spots where I'm not even 100% sure, even with the benefit of my own wisdom and the wisdom of many people who were much stronger than I am before me, and even with the computer's help. So it's really a fascinating ending, and I hope that it at least undermines this facile accusation that the game was just thrown. All right, so rook to d3 was not so stupid, first of all. Second, the obvious draw was not paralyzingly obvious at all. And even the better ideas required some real accuracy and often were very close to a loss, while rook to d3 is very close to a draw. So it's, again, not a trivial matter by any means. So I hope you learned something. I do realize this was a bit advanced. You might want to watch it again. But I do hope that it was beneficial and that you were able to at least pick up some important general principles, even if you didn't manage to understand quite everything that was covered. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time with something a bit lighter. So take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.